Well, good morning, and welcome to the belly of the beast. Welcome to the Parthenon of conservative ideas, and welcome to the new official headquarters of the deplorables. So, it's a beautiful day in Washington and a great day to be alive, especially if you're a conservative. If you came in, how many of you came in from the Union Station side of the building? And how many of you saw that giant 60 by 40-foot banner? Freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and our rallying cry, because America is worth fighting for. This is what it's all about. We're here today with you, our Heritage members from around the country, to celebrate, to reflect, and to look forward to what we'll be doing in 2017 and the many years ahead. Heritage Foundation is so grateful to our many members. The 250 of you here today in the room, the 2,500 who will be throughout the building in the next 48 hours, and the 500,000 and growing across this country. We're grateful not only because of your support, but because of your ideas. You fuel the fire of heritage. And as you've seen through the last several months in the election and the transition, heritage and these ideas help to fuel the fire of America. So we're grateful to you. We encourage you today to ask as many questions as you've got of our keynote speaker and of our two great panels. There are many members here today, many distinguished friends with us, and it is always very dangerous to single anybody out. But I must do that today because there's someone with us who has a very distinct honor and a very distinct recognition. He and his family are among the longest-serving, longest Heritage Foundation members that we have. They made their first gift to Heritage in 1974, 1 year after our founding. They're with us today, Pat and Robin Stranahan. And Pat and Robin, we are so grateful not only to what you've done for Heritage over the last 43 years, but for what your family and their iconic business, Champion Spark Plugs, have done to fund a revolution in transportation in this country, starting in the early last century, moving through the World War II and fueling and sparking all of the aircraft on allies. And so we're grateful to everything you do to inspire us and to inspire Americans and future generations. So just please a round of applause for Pat and Robin Stranahan. Now, speaking of spark plugs, close your eyes, if you would, for a minute and picture this. It's 1980. Ronald Reagan is just elected as president. And Democrats have controlled the House of Representatives for so long, since 1952, in fact, that this seemed part of the unchangeable landscape of Washington. One naturally accepted that we would always have a Soviet Union, we would always have a Cold War, and that the Democrats would always have the House. Maybe it's no accident that both of those things would end within a few short years of each other. Ronald Reagan, through his vision, saw what so many others could not, that the Soviet Union could and would collapse under its own weight into the dustbin of history. He was laughed at. And he, of course, was right. And largely because of that vision and his actions, that it was possible that the Cold War ended when it did. Well, what Ronald Reagan was to the Cold War, Newt Gingrich was to the Democratic reign in Congress. First elected to the House in 1978 from the state of Georgia, he, too, had a vision. He believed that Republicans could win a House majority if they gave people a reason to elect them, if they appealed to their aspirations. And he, too, was laughed at. And, of course, he, too, was right. In 1994, as minority whip of the House, he spearheaded the effort for the 10-point contract with America. And in a sea-change election, 54 seats moving from Democrats to Republicans. That forced Bill Clinton to work with Congress, led by their new Speaker, Newt Gingrich, passing many landmark pieces of legislation, including one that they worked very closely with the Heritage Foundation on, the Welfare Reform Bill. Like Reagan, Newt Gingrich demonstrated that what no one else thought was possible, you could do. And you can never underestimate, especially here in Washington, the power of those ideas and the power of that kind of vision. One other reflection. Roger Bannister, in 1954, ran a mile in less than 4 minutes for the first time. Up until that point, all of the experts said it could never be done. It was not possible. It was not physically or humanly possible, but he did it. And in 1955, 1 year later, 24 other runners did the same thing. They simply believed that it was possible. And it's that vision and that possibility that we are so inspired by. And in many ways, from 1994 through the 2016 election, which, by the way, he projected correctly, calling for Donald Trump months ahead of time, Newt Gingrich has, again, made us believe what many thought was impossible. We're delighted to have him here with us today. Please welcome our friend, our leader, Mr. Speaker, Newt Gingrich.
Thank you all very much. That was a little bit much. I always worry about the introductions where I start getting excited about the speaker. And then I realize it's me. But nonetheless, it was a very nice introduction. I'm very grateful. It's terrific to be back here at Heritage. And I was not involved in 73 and 74. I first ran for Congress in 74 in the middle of Watergate. And my many friends said to me, you can't possibly win against the dean of the Georgia delegation. As Nixon collapsed, it turned out they were right. I got 48.5%. And I came back and ran a second time in 1976. And in April of that year, still remember watching the Today Show as Jimmy Carter came from behind to win the Wisconsin primary against Mo Udall. And I realized that at that point that Jimmy Carter would be the Democratic nominee and that I would have to run the best campaign of my career in order to get close enough to run a third time. And I did that, and I ran really hard, and it was a really effective campaign. And when you're the candidate, you're surrounded by noise that says you're doing all right. And so on Election Day, I was very optimistic, and I went down to the Neva Lomason Library in Carrollton, Georgia. I stood in line to vote, and I realized that the four people directly in front of me had come from the local nursing home to get revenge for Sherman's march through Georgia. And I thought to myself, what are the odds that they are going to vote for Jimmy Carter as a favorite son and then split their ticket for a Yankee-born Army brat with a strange name and a weird accent teaching at a local college? I thought this is going to be a very long day. I went from 48.5 with the best campaign of my career down to 48.3. And the following Saturday, I was calculating and looking at things. I got 2 votes in Carroll County for every vote Gerald Ford got. And I just realized if you're the challenger, you can't run much further ahead and win. So I came back a third time and finally won in 78. And one of the things that carried me through that was getting to know Ed Fulner and being invited to lunch at the old Heritage Foundation, which was a tiny set of townhouses not far from here. And we would go to lunch, I think there's like Wednesdays or something we always meet. By the way, this is a sign of how big this place has become. I do not remember you ever serving hot chocolate. I think that's a sign of the new prosperity that Jim DeMint has brought to Heritage, that we've moved up a stage, so it's a great honor. And I really came and asked them if I could give a series of speeches here for a very symbolically historic reason, and that is that Heritage was the decisive intellectual center in the Reagan administration's bold policy changes. Heritage made over 2,200 recommendations in a 1,093-page report called Mandate for Leadership. It was really a remarkable achievement. And I was part of all that. I was a freshman member of Congress. I was hanging out regularly with the folks from Heritage. It really made a huge impact. And, of course, Heritage then, because it is truly an independent institution, 2 years later had the courage to grade Reagan on how well he had done. They gave him a 62. Now, on the one hand, that's not a very good grade. On the other hand, it's the highest grade ever achieved by any president from Heritage. So it's, this is a tough institution, deeply committed to real change. And in this transition, I can report to you, Heritage is once again playing a leadership role across the whole transition process. And these speeches are designed to reinforce the case for bold change. I think the speeches are also in the tradition of Heritage's vision statement, which is to build an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish, which I think is a pretty good statement of the concept of making America great again. So I think it's particularly important to be back here. I think there will ultimately be a total of 8 speeches at Heritage and 1 speech at the National Defense University. All of them will be available on the Heritage website and at Gingrich Productions. And ultimately, sometime in the spring, we'll produce a book called Understanding Trump. Now, these are which I think is that book will have a very large market because nobody does. And I'll get back to that. These speeches are an initial attempt to outline what I think are the dramatic changes brought about by the rise of President-elect Trump and Trumpism. Now, part of what I want you to understand, and this is all a gamble, okay? Trump has assembled, I think, a cabinet of winners. One of his challenges will be to turn into a team of winners, and that'll be very challenging because these are very strong, very successful personalities. If they come together as a team, and if they really focus on large-scale change, this will in fact be a historic opportunity. I believe it's an opportunity to end the 84-year dominance of the left, starting with Roosevelt in 1932. Reagan didn't end it. I didn't end it. It has continued to be the dominant underlying force in American culture and government. But we have a chance now to really do that, and that's part of what this is all about. I want to start, though, by reflecting on 3 large ideas the day before the inaugural. First, how different this week would have been if November 8th went the other way. I mean, if you want to understand what I mean by a watershed event, over here is the old order. Over here is Trump. And if you ask yourself, how would you have felt? First of all, you wouldn't be here. Right? You would be even more depressed. And I think, by the way, that Obama was counting on her winning. Because I think they thought that if they got 4 years of Hillary on top of 8 years of Obama, that they would really have driven into the culture a level of radicalism that would be virtually impossible to turn around. And that's part of why they're in such a paroxysm of agony because, remember that up until about 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock election night, they all collectively thought they were going to win. In fact, they thought they were going to win in a landslide. In fact, I've always wondered who was the person who had to go in and tell Hillary, we've had this boo-boo. And we don't quite know how to explain it, but you're not going to the White House, you're going to Westchester. That would have been, I'd love to have had the video. The amount we could have made selling Hillary reacts to being told she's not going to be president would have been a wonderful moment. But I want to start with this whole point. I have a proposition for conservatives, which they will find, and you remember this from we used to have these early Reagan lunches where people who were in the Reagan administration who were hardline conservatives would come to lunch at Heritage and spend the first 35 minutes complaining that Reagan was selling us out. Reagan was at that point the most conservative president of modern times. But on item 73B, they had found out that it wasn't quite what they believed in. And I finally one day, Ed and I both just said to him, you either quit being negative or don't come to lunch. Now, I have a proposition for the entire conservative movement. For 2 years, just 2 years, every time Trump does something you're not quite comfortable with, close your eyes and think President Clinton. And you will find that you are so happy overall with what Trump is doing that we'll get past the confusion and the turmoil and the difficulties. So the second, though, I want to talk about the difference between the long growth and development of Reaganism and the sudden explosive emergence of Trumpism. And third, I want to talk about the reality that Trump's opposition will be much more like that faced by Prime Minister Thatcher than that faced by President Reagan. First of all, I want to go back to this whole notion of Hillary winning. Because this is something conservatives can't come to grips with. One person saved us from Hillary Clinton. I don't think any other Republican candidate could have beaten her. Why don't you think about that? But you really think any of the others could have aroused the level of turnout that Trump aroused? You think they could have carried Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania? I don't think there's any evidence that any of them could have done it. So one person did it, and he did it his way. And I'll come back to that, but you really have to understand, this is a guy, I remember one point in midsummer, some reporter called me, and the reporter's inability to learn any of this is just astonishing. I mean, it's, you know, it's like zebras who keep watching other zebras getting eaten and think to themselves, but why are the lions unhappy? And you keep trying to explain, they're lions, they need lunch, your lunch. You know. And this reporter calls me and he says, doesn't it bother you that Hillary last month spent $30 million on political advertising and Trump spent like $300,000? And I said, I don't know. I was thinking about asking our nominee, Jeb Bush, how it feels to spend $108 million and get $1. I said, do you guys learn nothing out of the entire spring? Because the Trump model of communication is revolutionary. And it's one that all of the Republican candidates at governor, state legislature, you name it, should learn. You get up in the morning and you tweet, and then, of course, the news media goes crazy. Why does the news media go crazy? Because he is skipping past them. They hate tweeting. Tweeting means he communicates directly with you. So, of course, the news media hates it. Then he would call in to Fox and Friends, and they would chat cheerfully for a while. And then he would call in to Morning Joe and argue with them. And then about 10 a.m., he would do a press event. And then, having set the tone for the entire day, he would wait until he did an hour of Hannity. And then he would have had during the day about $7 million or $8 million of free media. And all of his opponents would go out and do fundraisers to raise the money to buy an ad to be drowned by Trump. Plus, he figured you could run any ad you wanted to attacking him, and he would be on TV explaining who he was. And ultimately, he'd win. By the way, one of the things this city never understood, and I'm going to come back to this, it never understood that for 13 years he'd done The Apprentice. So you'd say, gee, why is he so good on TV? Nobody in this city knew. This is a city of elites. It wasn't on PBS. It didn't follow Downton Abbey. And just because millions of yahoos watched it couldn't make it meaningful. So Trump's a guy who understands reality TV because he understands reality. And nobody got this. It was fascinating to watch, the gap in the two worlds. And these really are two worlds. I mean, there's a world of practical, serious, competent people over here, and there's Washington. And then it's satellite branches in New York and Los Angeles. So, we should remember that one of the reasons Trump has a level of authority, in addition to being president, is he is the person who stopped Hillary Clinton. And he is the person who stopped the Obama revolution. And nobody else could have done it. And he did it without much trouble. Second, it hit me what a remarkable difference there is between the development of Reagan and the development of Trump. Ed and I both, in many ways, had our early years shaped by Reaganism. And the truth is, the contract with America is simply Reagan. If you go through the contract, 95% of the contract came straight out of Reagan. And we were the last great victory of Reaganism. We could do the contract because for 20 years, most of us had heard Reagan give speeches. So we kind of understood what we were doing. We have not had that level of development since then. And I'm going to come back to why Trump is so different. Because think about Reagan. Reagan in 1947, as the head of the Actors Guild, has dinner one night with a member of the Guild who explains to Reagan that he is a true Stalinist, and when they win, they're either going to put Reagan in jail or shoot him. And Reagan goes home and realizes this guy's really sincere. And from that point on, he is unendingly anti-communist. And 44 years later, the Soviet Union disappears. But he has a long evolution of reading Marxism, reading about communism, studying, giving speeches. I mean, he's giving active speeches and doing TV about communism very early after that first encounter. Then, as his movie career began to wane, he is approached by a guy named Lemuel Boulware, who was one of the great unheralded heroes of American history. Boulware was the human relations vice president of General Electric, which at that time had a huge blue-collar workforce with 7 unions, 2 of whom were headed by communists, and the other 5 were headed by radicals. And Boulware had given a speech on Alumni Day at Harvard Business School in 1949, saying that there's a wave of socialism and collectivism going across the planet, and if we don't educate our workers and our stockholders, we are going to cease to have free enterprise. And so he developed what became, but back then was actually a form called Boulwarism. And I recommend to everybody who want to understand Reagan that they read a very small book called The Education of Ronald Reagan by Tom Evans, who had been in both the Nixon and Reagan White Houses as a lawyer. It's a brilliant book. So Boulware figures out he can't negotiate with the union leaders because they're all radicals. But what he could do, he sells his CEO on educating the workforce about economic reality so they won't support a strike. So the union leaders can't say, well, I'm not going to accept this, we're just going to go on strike, because the workers wouldn't vote for a strike. And as he developed this very elaborate communications plan, and he developed a model he called moving the M. He said, if you have a line, wherever the majority is, the political leadership has to follow. So his job was to move the majority to economic rationality, and then the political leaders, who were the union bosses, who had to get elected, had to ultimately operate within the constraint of where the majority went. And then he said, gee, I need somebody attractive who will interest workers in listening to him. And Ronald Reagan was at the end of his movie career, and he got a contract with General Electric. Reagan gave 375 speeches, most of them to blue-collar audiences, and most of them involving Q&A. So by the time he ran for governor, he actually had done this over and over. Interestingly, Reagan had a very bad airplane flight in 1945 and wouldn't fly. And so everywhere he went for GE, he went by train. And Boulware would give him conservative economic books to read. So here you have this potential future president reading conservative economics, reading Hayek, for example, as he went around the country to speak to blue-collar audiences, to personalize and make sense of free enterprise at the level of average workers. And that was the background. And so Reagan spent years developing his approach and his thinking. He also said to a friend of mine one time, we went to see him about a very sophisticated technology and defense, and he was so stunned, he said to Governor Reagan at that time, I'd really like to meet the person who briefed you, because you clearly are so well briefed. And Reagan laughed and said, nobody briefed me. He said, on the movie sets, I didn't play cards. I read. So you had a guy who really was, if you go to the ranch, you'll realize Reagan was a genuine intellectual. He wasn't some theoretical academic intellectual, but he's a man who believed in ideas, thought ideas mattered, learned his whole life. In that setting, by 1964, he's giving his first great national speech, which is for Goldwater, A Time for Choosing. And I cannot, if you've never seen it, it's worth your finding it on YouTube. And that introduces Reagan to the country. In 1965, he flies for the first time in 20 years because his brother calls him one evening and says, a group of us want to have breakfast in San Francisco in the morning to talk about you running for governor. And Ronnie goes, well, you know I don't fly. And I can't get there. And he says, well, you want to be governor? The plane leaves at 7:05. And he hung up. And at 7:05, Reagan was on the plane because he wanted to be governor. An interesting example, very parallel to Trump, and the part of great leadership. Reagan is being coached by Spencer and Roberts, who were the best political consultants in California at the time. And they keep saying to him, all that student noise at Berkeley is not an issue. And Reagan is doing Q&A sessions, town hall meetings, because they're trying to prove that Reagan's smart enough to be governor, because back then the thought was if you're an actor, you can't really be governor. And so they'd given him this box full of issues to learn, and as an actor, he could learn stuff very fast. And so he'd go into these town hall meetings, the first, second, and third question were about Berkeley. And he'd come after the meeting, he'd say to his consultants, guys, we really have to develop some answers about Berkeley. And they said, no, Berkeley's not an issue. Because again, in the elites, Berkeley wasn't an issue. About the third time this happened, Reagan said, Berkeley may not be an issue to you, but it's an issue to the people of California. It's very similar to how Trump dealt with this whole process, which is the consultants are obsolete, they're out of touch, they're talking to themselves. I think I'll just go over here and win. And Trump was his own primary consultant, which saved him a huge amount of money and a great deal of failure. So Reagan then governs for 8 years, which is pretty good practice, the largest state in the country. And in 75 and 76, he wages a national campaign for president in which he draws clear distinction between the establishment Republicans who are for Ford and what Reaganism is all about. By 1980, he has a very formed general ideology, which the final piece of which is supply-side economics, which Jack Kemp helps bring to him. And in that process, you have a guy now who from 1947 to 1980 has been evolving. And that's the framework within which Reaganism existed. By contrast, Trump's totally different. And I recommend to all of you to read The Art of the Deal and The Art of the Comeback, which are really both personal books and business books. They're not political books, but they give you a sense of how he operates. And so what you have is a guy who is very famous very early. By 1980, in the late 80s, The Art of the Deal is a #1 New York Times bestseller. It's on the bestseller list for about a year. He's emerging as a constant celebrity in New York media. Oprah Winfrey asked him in 1988 on her TV show, are you going to run for president? And he says, not unless the country gets to be a total mess, which we managed to achieve the goal so that he could then have a good reason to run. And in 1989, February of '89, he's the cover of Time magazine. So he emerges as a celebrity and as an entrepreneur and as a very successful business person, but not as a political person. And so he has lots of opinions, but he doesn't have policies. You know, because he's just a guy who makes a lot of money and does a lot of cool things and, you know, hangs out, like on TV or with a tie. I mean, he invents Trump ties. He takes over the Miss Universe. I mean, he's very busy because to understand Trump, you just have to take, he's 1/3 Andrew Jackson for disruption, 1/3 Theodore Roosevelt for compulsive energy, and 1/3 P.T. Barnum for permanent salesmanship. And if you put those together, you begin to get the Trump method and the Trump pattern. So if you look at all that, there are two specific reading assignments to understand why the elites did not understand Trump. The first is a very sobering book by Charles Murray. Murray had written the best book, I think, on welfare reform called Losing Ground in the 1980s, which we used very intensely. And we did work very closely with Heritage in designing welfare reform. Murray, 2 years ago, wrote a book called Coming Apart, which is about white America. And his core thesis is that for the first time in American history, there are super zip codes, what he calls super zips. And a super zip code is where people are in the top 5% of income and the top 5% of education. And he says what's beginning to happen is people who go to Princeton, Yale, and Harvard marry people who go to Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. They then put their kids in prep school so they can get into Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. And they now live in the same neighborhood with everybody else who went to Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. And these are and he has a map of super zip codes. And he says the #1 reality of these people is they know nothing about normal Americans, which is why they didn't understand The Apprentice, because it literally was outside their comprehension. And so this is why, normal Americans talk in a different language than elites talk, and Trump's campaign speeches are at the 4th grade level. Not because he's stupid, but because he understands that if you talk at the 4th grade level, over 90% of the country understands you. Hillary talked in the language of somebody who went to an elite school, which guaranteed that on most days, 80% of the country did not resonate to what she was saying. Fundamentally different models. But she felt so good. This is a big advantage of Obama. Obama felt like the college professor you wanted to have. And so everybody who'd ever been to school thought, isn't this wonderful? But everybody else thought, this is weird. And the longer it went on, the weirder it got. So these kind of models are very, very powerful. To me, the essence of this was captured in a very short essay you can look up, you can Google, called Intellectual Yet Idiot, or IYI, by Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan. His thesis is very simple, that at least 40% of the governing elite is made up of people who are very good at taking exams and writing essays. So they get into elite schools where they study under professors who are very good at taking exams and writing essays. And because they're very good at taking exams and writing essays, they get very good grades. So they then get to the New York Times or the Supreme Court or senior federal bureaucracy or TV, and they sound really good because they're really good at being articulate. Their only weakness is they don't know anything. So they could write an essay on how to change a tire, but if you showed up and said, by the way, my car has a flat, they would have no clue, and they'd wonder why you wanted them to do something practical. Whereas if you'd like them to write on the theory of tire changing, they could do an entire volume. And I think this explains a great deal of what was going on. And I'll give you the most recent example. The absolute absurdity of the intelligence community of the United States, having known for months, and I think, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I think John McCain said he first told them in December of last year, that there was an opposition report in which a retired British agent for money wrote that Trump may have had a relationship with the Russians because of a meeting between a specific person and a Russian in Prague. This is a fairly specific, validatable message. Now, in terms of the intellectual yet idiot, because I'm a historian, and I spent a large part of my career actually looking at facts. I'm not a political scientist or I don't believe in any system which has lines. Because lines imply a patterning that humans don't actually live in. So as a historian, I actually like facts. I mean, where was Gettysburg? Did the Union and Confederate Army fight at Gettysburg? What days did it fight? When did the rain start? This is the way you train, which means you spend a lot of your time trying to do research. So if I had encountered a suggestion that a specific named person had been in Prague on a specific date, meeting with Russians, and I'd been the head of the CIA or the director of national intelligence, I would have said to a very junior person, maybe an intern, would you call this person and ask if they've ever been in Prague? Now, I know this is bold. I mean, we're out at the cutting edge here of actually doing something. And you'll notice I want to delegate it to the lowest person possible because they may still have the habit of doing something. They may not yet have learned that doing nothing but writing well is really more important to be promoted than actually doing something. Now, the person in question turns out to never have been in the Czech Republic. Now, I would then pose, as somebody who's studied history and geography, I once taught geography for a while, if you haven't been in the Czech Republic, you can't have been in Prague. I mean, I don't want to go too fast here. These are big ideas. But here's what bothers me, frankly, about the Republicans in the Congress. I have yet to hear either of the intelligence committees say, what we ought to be investigating is the utter, total incompetence of an entire intelligence system in which nobody thought to check with the person and to find out whether or not it was true. I mean, it's bad enough that they leaked it. It's worse that they didn't have any clue how stupid it was. And that's why when I was asked the other day by some reporter, shouldn't Trump work to get along with the intelligence community, I said no. He should tell Dan Coats, the new director of national intelligence, I want you to overhaul the entire system until we actually get people in charge who can do real work, who can actually think, and who can look for facts. I mean, this is how sick the whole system, it's equally bad at the Veterans Administration, it's equally bad in the Pentagon. I mean, this concept of intellectual yet idiot is very important to understand how much the system has eroded. Because we now have people who have pseudo-education, so they get a pseudo-PhD or a pseudo-master's degree. But we now value the degree, so we say, wow, so-and-so got a degree from Harvard and a degree from MIT. My question is, can they do anything? I mean, I don't care where their degrees are from, I care whether or not they know anything. And this is a very core crisis of the system, and it'll be very interesting to see to what degree the people Trump has assembled as a general principle are people who actually get things done. So they measure achievement, not credentials. And it'll be interesting to see if they can, in fact, build a team that can continue to do that despite the weight of the city and the weight of the news media. So, let me now carry you to the last part, which is, let me say in passing, Trumpism is a work in progress. I tell everybody, I cannot tell you what Trump is going to do tomorrow. Not tomorrow. Tomorrow he's going to go give an inaugural speech. But if you were to say to me, so what's he going to, in fact, I said this on Fox and Friends this morning, and I look blank. Yeah, what's he going to do Saturday? I can't tell you, because he can't tell you. I want you to think of Trumpism as a table. The table has 4 legs. One leg is anti-politically correct. One leg is anti-left. One leg is anti-stupidity. And one leg is passionately pro-American. And Trump migrates across the table based on opportunity and threat. And he is so fast and moves so quickly that we have no models. I mean, maybe Andrew Jackson, but that was a long time ago in a different framework. We have no modern models for a chief executive who does this. And so he's going to assemble a team, delegate to the team, and then he's going to migrate back and forth wherever he wants to within this framework. And I tell conservatives, he is not an ideological traditional conservative, but he may be the most effective anti-left political leader of the last 100 years. And you need to understand the difference in those two. And you need to understand, just relax. He'll do something. I mean, we don't have to be able to predict him. We just have to watch and then try to help him learn as he goes through this extraordinary process. So, the third point I want to make is, this only bubbled up as I watched the last 3 weeks. The 60 members who aren't going to show up or whatever it is tomorrow, which I think is fine. I mean, if you want to allow us to know exactly how hostile you are from day one, I think that's useful. It allows you to not worry about them, just run over them on a regular basis. And, you don't have to pretend you're going to get their votes. You don't have to worry about them. And most of them are in very, very safe seats. And this is what happened to the British Labour Party under Thatcher. So what they do is they pull their party to the left. It gets nuttier and nuttier. And the average person goes, that's really weird. But their base all cheers and chants, weirdness is good, weirdness is good. Which is a strange way to build a party. I think the fact is that they are a symbol, because I tried to figure out, the news media has learned nothing and gotten even more terrified. The left is getting more and more, excited. And it hit me that we have no American parallel, but the Thatcher did. And the difference, I think, is very simple. Thatcher was a direct threat to both the value system and the power structure of the left in Great Britain. Reagan wasn't. Reagan's goal was to defeat the Soviet Empire, and within the context of the traditional system, to accelerate economic growth and rebuild a belief in America and American history. But he didn't spend a lot of time, even when he was governor, he didn't spend a lot of time trying to dramatically reshape the Berkeley faculty or to take on the core value system of the left. Because as long as he was winning, he didn't care. If he could just defeat the Soviet Empire, regrow the economy, he'd done what he set out to do. Trump is a direct mortal threat to both the value system of the left, because he's so politically incorrect, and to the power structure of the left. I mean, the Trump system cannot be made to work unless they reform the civil service. Reforming the civil service will be life and death to the bureaucratic unions. The Trump system doesn't work as long as our children are being taught idiocy, by tenured professors who make no sense, which is why you're starting to see in some states, we now have 25 states that have Republican control of the House, Senate, and governor. I think probably the largest number in history. And so what you're beginning to have in a couple states is they're taking away tenure. And all of a sudden the left is going, but you can't take away tenure because we have to have freedom of speech, which means, of course, freedom of coercion. Because their idea of freedom of speech is their speech, not anybody else's. And so this is going to be a real collision. And we have to recognize that there's a great book I recommend to all of you by Clara Berlinski entitled There Is No Alternative, and the subtitle is Why Margaret Thatcher Matters. And her point is that Thatcher did two things. She directly, morally assaulted the intellectual framework of the left. There's a great moment when she first becomes opposition leader, and she's speaking at the Conservative Party conference, and she had this huge handbag. And she says, people ask me, what is our platform? And she takes up Hayek's, I think, what's Constitutional Liberty. Constitutional Liberty is a big book. And she has this big book in her, she slams it. And she says, I'll tell you what our platform is. It's Hayek. And of course, 2/3 of the Tory members are going, who's Hayek? What does this mean? Why is she yelling at me? I don't know. But, you know, her famous line, the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money to spend. But you go back and read her speeches, and Berlinski does a good job of pulling these together. She's a novelist normally. But she got fascinated with, she had been anti-Thatcher when she was a young student at Oxford, and then over the years she decided Thatcher was right and she was wrong. And so, and she has a whole series of Thatcher just assailing socialism, which is exactly what Trump should do. I mean, what Trump did the other day to John Lewis was exactly right. John Lewis is, and I used to represent Atlanta. I used to represent part of Lewis's district. Atlanta has rising crime. The schools are failing to teach poor children. I mean, it's not as bad as Chicago, but it's got lots of things that aren't working. And the political power structure of the left can't allow anything to be fixed. I talked to Rudy Giuliani yesterday about the impact he had with Comstat in New York, and he said we basically had crime under control in 18 months. Nobody from Chicago would contemplate bringing in Giuliani because, after all, what are 4,000 people being shot as long as they're on the South Side? 4,000 people last year were shot in Chicago, which turns out to be third. St. Louis, Baltimore, Chicago per capita. And yet we have the very people who should be saying, as Trump said in Charlotte, he wants to have a new deal for African Americans. You would think that people like John Lewis would say, gosh, what do you have in mind? But they can't, because they are more left than they are representative of their constituencies. And so this is going to be very much like Thatcher. The second thing was Thatcher was confronted by the power of the coal miners' union. And she spends years laying the base for what is in effect a civil war. Because the coal miners' union believes it can starve Britain out, it can cut off all production of coal, and it can cripple the economy, and that they will have to give in. This is the Patco strike on a giant scale. And she says, look, we are now and she saw herself in Churchillian terms. Either the elected officials of the British people are in charge in Parliament, or the miners' union is in charge. But there's no middle ground here. And so they had a head-on fight. Well, I guarantee you, if the Trump team decides they're going to get control of the federal bureaucracy, it will be comparable to the fight with the coal miners' union. Remember that when Scott Walker did it on a smaller scale in Madison, they had 100,000 people in the street, the Capitol was occupied for 6 months, and both Scott and his wife had death threats. I mean, these people they're playing for keeps. They want to own this country. They want to run this country, and they want to turn it into a left-wing country. And the more Trump is direct in changing that, the more dramatic it will be. Now, what can we do? A couple things. One, be noisily supportive. Use social media, Twitter, Facebook, email. Two, every time the news media does something wrong, scream at them. Just pound on them. Don't pretend that we should pay attention to them in a positive way and say, oh, gee, yeah, we really feel bad that happened. Three, talk to your senators and your congressmen. I mean, while you're up here, if you go by and see them, just say to them, I'm really counting on you to work with Trump. It's very important that the pressure be towards Trump, particularly on our side. not away from Trump, and the people not be confused. 4, help defeat the anti-Trump Democrats in 2018 and start by putting pressure on this year. We can find every state in which there's a Democratic senator up that Trump carried, and we can start building this spring grassroots efforts to say to those people, you either vote with us in the Senate or we're going to beat you back home. It's your call. You decide whether you'd like us to make sure you don't come back or you'd like to come back by voting with us. We'll take success either way. In addition, I think we have an opportunity. I'm trying to work with the Trump team to set up crowdsourcing regulatory reform. Imagine that every school board, every city council, every small business, every hospital, every university was asked, what are the dumbest, worst regulations that we should repeal? And we began to bubble up from the country regulatory reform. It's a project I think Heritage is going to do that I think you'll have a real opportunity here to make a real difference in history. Help your local state legislators, city council, county commission, school board develop Trumpism in your state. Encourage your governor to work there. We need, for example, a governor's working group on regulatory reform. We need a governor's working group on Medicaid. These are things where we really can begin to build a momentum. And finally, in honor of Jim DeMint and Ed Fulmer and a lifetime of working with these guys, keep supporting Heritage and developing key issues. Heritage is a very important part of the building block of the change we're going to try to achieve. So I hope this is useful. I apologize that I've got to go actually make another speech, but I cannot tell you how helpful working with Heritage in this project has been, how much I look forward to the next 2 weeks. We're going to do continue the series, and I hope you'll find Understanding Trump this spring to be useful as a sort of core guide to it. And all the speeches are now available at the Heritage website, so you can see it there. But I think we are gathered together for a truly historic inaugural. I think we have a chance to work with the new president and the new vice president to truly achieve remarkable things. And I am very, very grateful to Heritage for allowing me to be a part of that process. Thank you all very, very much.